So with that, I want to thank Kevin Dockendorf for being our webinar presenter for today and for this month. Kevin, as you can see on the screen, is our Fisheries Research Coordinator in our Inland Fisheries Division. And his presentation today is about largemouth bass movement at Lake Mattamuskeet and associated canals. And with that, again, thanks, Kevin, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And thank you, Mallory, for all the technical support. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate you being here and taking time out of your schedule to join us today. To get started, I'd just like to recognize, making sure everybody can hear me, but also recognize the federal aid in sport fish restoration, the primary funding source for the Inland Fisheries Division. This project couldn't have been done without this work. Generally speaking, we speak of our management objective to conduct independent and dependent fisheries surveys to investigate population dynamics, to develop quality fisheries for anglers that seek recreational important fish species. And today I'll talk a little bit about mostly about the independent component of this work, but I also did do some a creel survey in 2014 that helps inform just a little bit of this as well. All right, and today we're gonna go to Lake Mattamuskeet, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen the iconic Mattamuskeet Lodge. The history of Mattamuskeet Lodge and Lake Mattamuskeet is steeped in Hyde County. I could take the whole day today and talk about the history of the lake, but we only have 45 minutes, so I'll stay focused on that timeline. And a little bit more orientation. This map is courtesy of Wendy Stanton with the Fish and Wildlife Service. It starts kind of in the left-hand corner with the yellow star in North Carolina, all the way to the coastal plain in North Carolina in Hyde County. To the right, it focuses in a little bit more, showing a little bit more the direction to the Pamlico Sound on the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula. And then focusing just a little bit more into the actual lake environment, the boundary of the Mattamuskeet Wildlife Refuge in red, and then 4 outfall canals in yellow that are each have their own water control structure. The images are indicative of one of those, but there are 4 individual water control structures that have tidal gates and flow out when the lake is water level is higher in the lake, and close when the sound side or canals are higher than the lake. Lake Mattamuskeet is the centerpiece of the Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge. Mattamuskeet Wildlife National Refuge personnel and staff and refuge complex are all important partners to this, and certainly important to our collaboration of any work done at Lake Mattamuskeet. As noted in the background, you see a few swans flying, and that's important to the Atlantic Flyway, integral part of that Atlantic Flyway for waterfowl. Huge 40,000 acre lake, shallow, generally less than 3 feet, very few spots deeper than 5 or 6 feet. As mentioned earlier, it does have a canal system associated with it that was a part of the history of Mattamuskeet when it was once drained, attempted 3 times but failed, and was turned over to the federal government in 1937. And management activities have occurred since then, both primarily for waterfowl, but also these Mattamuskeet canals are Mattamuskeet is inland fishing waters of which we have jurisdiction. So as Katie Patoka and Chris Smith are the district fisheries biologists, and they conduct fisheries surveys routinely there and inform the refuge as to those activities and any management actions that may need to occur there. Appreciate all all staff that are involved with Lake Mattamuskeet, from enforcement to wildlife to fisheries, a huge part of that collaboration. So special thanks to all of you, and appreciate all your work, including those in the director's office. Thank you. All right. So fishing at Lake Mattamuskeet with the size Hans Vogelsong from East Carolina conducted a survey of all refuges in Northeast and Southeast Virginia, seven of those refuges, and Mattamuskeet was one of those surveyed. And the primary activity conducted by refuge visitors, by 71% of the refuge visitors in 2006. In 2014, we updated that information with a formal creel survey that I worked on, and this map here kind of highlights the importance of Mattamuskeet to our anglers. In 2014, there was anglers from 54 North Carolina counties. 17 states were represented in that. A little bit more that are closer to North Carolina, but you see from even Texas, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Michigan, also visited. We also looked at the frequency, where 1 to 5 visits monthly, and annual visits could range between 1 and 30. So some anglers visiting it quite a bit, and others only visiting it once. And this is a compilation of all angling activity, including crabbing. So in 2014, the estimated angler effort by target species at Lake Mattamuskeet, we narrowed down to or categorized in the top 5. Blue crabs on the right exhibited the most angler effort in hours, followed then by channel catfish, white perch, black crappie, and largemouth bass, rounding out the top 5. And usually that's a little bit largemouth bass are generally a little bit higher than that. And as my image there depicts, this is where anglers became concerned and began asking questions about the abundance of largemouth bass at Lake Mattamuskeet. Well, during that time, it was about 8% fishing effort for largemouth bass, and the catch per hour was about 0.8 largemouth bass, or almost 1 largemouth bass an hour. And what we did find at Mattamuskeet, that's a little bit different than across North Carolina for the #1 game fish in North Carolina and throughout the United States, was at Mattamuskeet about 34% of largemouth bass were harvested. That's important because throughout the nation, harvest rate for largemouth bass is quite low, and often less than 5%, and maybe even less than 1% in some of our more popular lakes. So it's important to keep this in mind as I speak about largemouth bass at this lake. Well, as I mentioned, Katie and Chris sample Lake Mattamuskeet. In 2013, electrofishing survey showed that there was a difference in collections of largemouth bass in canals. We have them named as Jarvis, Main Canal, Rose Bay Canal, and then on the lakeside was relatively lower than the catch rates in the canals. Opportunity to conduct a research project was present, and we took it on ourselves to conduct the movement study to learn a little bit more about largemouth bass at Lake Mattamuskeet. And the concerns from the anglers were they weren't catching largemouth bass like they once did, but from the previous slide and catch rates, the catch rates are actually pretty high in the electrofishing sampling, so it didn't really match what we were seeing, that the abundance, the independent abundance appeared to be what we expected, but anglers were concerned. So we wanted to check in to see if there was something we could learn from a movement study and determine where largemouth bass may visit in the lake and inform us that way. So the project objectives were to surgically implant acoustic tags in the largemouth bass and track those with passive acoustic receivers. We'd also monitor the water levels and environmental parameters available to us and evaluate these fine scale movement in relation to their release location and the habitats that are available at Lake Mattamuskeet. And this study was conducted between 2017 and 2019. I did want to mention a little bit about the project budget. It's important to note that this was internal agency research and primarily with my position, but also in collaboration with other available resources within the agency. So I put together a brief budget here that doesn't really take into account my time or what I actually have as far as vehicles and boats. But what it does do is it looks at the number of acoustic receivers I would have needed to conduct this project as standalone, the tags and surgery supplies, and active tracking equipment that would be needed. And that value was, as a standalone cost, would have been about $77,000 to conduct the work. But using available resources that Vemco receivers were already present in our inventory, many in the Piedmont. We also have collaborations with North Carolina State University and receivers that were available through them. Surgery supplies, various equipment available that the hatcheries had, such as Ovidine for sterilization needs and those types of things. So, in borrowing the active tracking equipment from NC State were some of the actual costs associated with that. So just by that collaboration and conducting this work internally, we have a savings of about $62,000 to the project. So emphasizing the internal research opportunity here and appreciate working with all staff and I'm sure I'll do a terrible job of thanking you all throughout, but and each individual that did help me, but thank you so much. All right, so to look at the lake in the study sites, have a graphic here of placement of receivers. And the lake is bisected by the Highway 94 causeway that was built in 1952-53. And there are 5 culverts that connect the water at the lake there. So I utilize that opportunity to place available receivers at those points. But focusing more now to the shorelines on the western shore, southwest shoreline and the southeast shoreline, the receivers in green are what were indicated as gates between the lake and canal interface, such that if bass were to use the lake, they would stay in the lake and I'd only hear them on the lakeside receiver. If they stayed in the canal, then the fish were indicated as canal. And if they ever passed through that gate, then that would also be detected. There's also receivers that are highlighted in purple that were placed within the lake and as they became available to me throughout. But all receivers were in place by July of 2017. A little more detail on the stationary receiver array where these gates occurred and how we were going to listen to the largemouth bass that were acoustically tagged. There's a Vemco receivers, and the Vemco tag is surgically implanted into the bass. The acoustic receiver was attached to a PVC post that was just over top of a smaller diameter PVC post, specifically a 2-inch PVC post overlaid on a 1.5-inch PVC post, made for easy detection and retrieval of the receivers for maintenance and downloading of data. An important aspect of acoustic receivers are to determine your listening range and that accuracy. So prior to the study, I conducted a range test and determined a 90% accuracy at 100 meters. And then to ensure there wasn't overlap between the two gates, I doubled that distance and you set the receivers apart at 250 meters. We also captured water quality and quantity. Appreciate the help from Nevin Spone on the collection and help out there on the lake. But we also do have USGS gauges to collect data every 15 minutes. And that is both funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service and our agency. There's two gauges, one on the east side of the lake and one on the west side of the lake. These gauges capture lake level, temperature, dissolved oxygen, and salinity. And I mentioned the fish tagging procedures or the fish tagging. And those procedures that we were utilized was to anesthetize largemouth bass with Aqua-S. And this was an AADAP approved project in order to use the Aqua-S on these largemouth bass. There was an incision made with implanting two tags. One was the Vemco receivers or Vemco tags, excuse me. And the second was a pit tag, so that in the event that the Vemco tag stopped working and we captured a fish and could wand the fish to find it as a pit tag and continue to identify that fish. We did not use external tags to identify the fish as an opportunity to learn more about the angler harvest. We felt that we had a good handle from the 2014 survey that informed our harvest rates. A single suture was used and recovery was monitored in a 24-hour holding pen. We'll see if the video does work for everyone else. We did have some testing today that was successful, so let's see if it still works for us now. Give a little bit about how the tags were implanted. Reaching in to grab one of the Vemco tags to implant. Suturing up the fish. All right. Oh. All right. So with that video complete, we'll move into some of the results of the initial fish survival, a 24-hour holding pen for post-op recovery. They were held overnight in a live car. I've got to highlight this live car construction and design by Kyle Rachels and assistance from Ben Ricks during that time, and they put together this awesome live car. And it was 100% initial survival of all 42 largemouth bass tagged. I'm sorry, of the 30 largemouth bass tagged, there were 8 controls that only were electrofished, and then they were placed into the live car as well. All of those survived. I also checked for suture being intact. Actually had one to resuture. That one was held again overnight and then released the next day. Oops, sorry. And then the release of the tagged largemouth bass in May of 2017, as I indicated about the 30 largemouth bass, I placed 15 on the west side of the lake and 15 on the east side of the lake. And we also had additional tags that were available to us from another Piedmont project, which gives us the total of 42 largemouth bass at large. And we placed tag 12, placed 6 in the East Canal and 6 in the West Canal. And wanted to recognize again Nevin Spohn and Jen Atherton for their help throughout this project. Okay, I mentioned that Mattamuskeet is shallow, and this image depicts searching for one of the receivers that were knocked over during the ice out in December of 2018. And I appreciate everyone attempting there. We ended up just losing one receiver out of all 31 that we set out there. So the water quantity that was measured at the USGS gauges, there was a brief gap in January, but this shows that the water level was about 2 feet at the start of the project and about 3 feet towards the end of the project. The graphic in the lower left kind of gives an indication of where the deeper side and the western side of the lake is in relation to the east side, and those shorelines that are relatively shallow, and then is that mean depth of 3 feet or less. For largemouth bass detections, had 609,875 detections for the 42 largemouth bass that were tagged. But there was a 29 individuals after 2017 that were monitored, and then another 8 individuals that were available in March of 2019 in the last round of detections. To look at that visually and how each fish contributed to those 609,000 detections, I plotted each fish that was tagged with circles, but the fish that were tagged and released in the lake, they have a white circle, and then those that were tagged in the canal have a dark circle. And on the bottom, on the x-axis, is the individual largemouth bass total length in inches. So from 10 inches to about 24 inches was the range. And on the y-axis, we have total detections in a log scale, because some of these fish were detected multiple times, hundreds of thousands of times, compared to some that may have only been detected hundreds of times. So I placed that in a log scale just to get a look here as to the size and relative numbers of detections. And generally speaking, here we have a shotgun pattern. Really, the size they would provide detections along this gradient relatively, regardless of size. One thing to keep in mind about the tags I didn't mention earlier was that it required fish that were greater than 12 inches due to the weight needs, and to ensure that the tag weight was less than 2% of the total weight of the largemouth bass tagged. All right. And so also the opportunity to use R presented itself, given that there's the VIEW program, and then there's entire packages dedicated to the available data based on lat long. The one package that was out there at the time was called MoveViz, just looking at the lat long of every detection, basically at the point of the receiver, the lat long of that receiver, and was able to plot that data. Before I get into the animation, I'm going to first break this down just a little bit by release location. See here. There we go. Okay, so this is 4 shots of the lake. The background is the same. It's got the same receiver points, and then it's broken out by the West Canal release sites, the West Lake release locations, the East Canal release location, and the East Lake release locations, meaning on the lake there's 15 that represent on the west side, 15 bass on the east side, and 6 bass in the canals on the East Canal, and 6 bass in West Canal. We grouped these together to look at that. The individual components, which I'll show you shortly, highlights kind of the challenges if we're to look at each individual fish. They would tell their own story in a way. So categorically, these are the locations and the detections of where they occur. So East Canal, you see a very large dot, but not very many other dots anywhere throughout the lake except for one spot here on the southeast shoreline. Compare that to East Lake side, where 15 bass were heard almost throughout the entire portion of the lake. Moving over to the west side and the West Canal, those fish tended to be more in the west side of the lake and in the canal and in the lake. And in West Lake, they were mostly in the lake. So here we'll see if this next animation will work for us to see all those fish. And this is the MoveViz package, brings in all of those tagged fish together. You'll see the clock running in the top center as to the date of detection. Each one of those colors is an individual fish. So attempting to try to pull each one of those out and explain that in those trends was a little bit of a challenge, but you see, and it just reset now. So 2017 and moving through October, coming into the year of 2018, these fish are still moving around. MoveViz times all of those detections within that date time interval. And let this keep going until March of 2019 when it will reset. Okay, so I'm going to break that down, slow that down just a little bit in graphic format. And I know this is super busy, and I just wanted to try to show where I made the gate of these fish, and on the lake side would be in green, and on the canal side would be in blue. So in the East Canal, we noticed that those fish spent a lot of time in East Canal with a preference towards that canal, as compared to East Lake. The East Lake release locations, those 15 fish were detected on both lake and canal sides. West Canal were represented in both habitats, but you'll notice there was somewhat of a stop around September of 2018, and you'll see that too in the East Canal. And then in the West Lake, there is a relative preference for the lakeside, more green on the lakeside as compared to canal on the blue side. And so those there was I mentioned about on the East Canal and West Canal components, there appeared to be a relative stop, and just wanted to share some tag detection influences. And in September of 2018, Hurricane Florence was prominent in the area, and likely contributed to low dissolved oxygen in the canals. We did notice that, and that was about the same time that those canal acoustically tagged fish, the detections were relatively absent. And it could be because of that water quality that the largemouth bass tagged in the canal succumbed. The battery life of tags is also important here. I mentioned that we were able to use some tags that couldn't be used in another project. They had pretty much all their battery life because the tag attempt was one day, and once the tags couldn't be used, the magnets were placed on and used that. And there was a similar ping rate, so that's why we used those tags in that project. But still, because of those different tags, it's possible that battery life may have been reduced. And also to mention that angler harvest, so there were fish available in July 2017, 29, and by March of 2019, there were 8 acoustically tagged fish still at large being heard on the receivers. All right, but what's interesting, we did have Vemco tag number 18276. This fish was tagged and released in June 26th of 2017 in the East Main Canal. It was our largest bass tagged at 23 inches and 6 pounds. As I mentioned, September 2018 was when Hurricane Florence hit, and we considered that maybe the low dissolved oxygen levels may have influenced the survival of those fish. But this fish was actually captured by Chris and Katie October 30th of 2018, and they were able to find that pit tag at Outfall Canal. It was at large for 492 days or 70 weeks and 2 days. May have already noticed that the length shrank a half an inch, and the weight was gained 1 ounce. So those older fish may or may not always gain weight as they're at large. All right. So some of the management implications of that is that the current habitat options are influential to largemouth bass abundance, and it highlights that largemouth bass may use the lake environments and spend a lot of time in many locations throughout the lake. So the sampling may not always capture what fish are out in the lake, as maybe in the canal, where it's maybe a little bit more constricted or more habitat available. And sampling is different for both of those habitats. So Katie and Chris sample those habitats when they can. Oftentimes the lake is too shallow to sample effectively, but in years they can get out and then also to sample canal and lake environments and treat them as different sampling locations. And with that, angling success may vary depending on that lake or canal. So if anglers are interested in fishing the lake as compared to fishing the canal, they just may have better luck in the canal versus the lake, or in the lake versus the canal, as catching often is different than fishing. Also take a moment to recognize the USGS gauges. We were looking at, does lake level influence that movement pattern? And in general, it appears that it's more dependent upon where the habitat, where the bass were released at and where they used that, and they moved around depending on that. But when more water is available, it's quite possible that those fish will move to alternate locations. But we really didn't see that if it was higher water levels or relatively higher water levels. Bass weren't moving from the canal into the lake, or really from the lake to the canal in all cases. Note too that dissolved oxygen and water temperature are pretty consistent on each side of the lake, but wanted to note here that the salinity on the west side was similar until the hurricane event in September of 2018. So there was a little bit of pulse of salinity there. So it's important to keep that in mind and keep those two gauges, as those types of lakes could be different throughout the year. As mentioned about the migratory waterfowl as the primary management strategy, we do have a Mattamuskeet Technical Working Group that includes folks from Wildlife Commission and Fish and Wildlife Service to consider management challenges at the lake. And those that are aware of Lake Mattamuskeet and how important that SAV, or submerged aquatic vegetation, is. For the last 5 years, it really hasn't been in existence. It's Fish and Wildlife Service surveys show about 0% coverage of SAV at Lake Mattamuskeet. And that in and of itself, the absence of SAV would influence largemouth bass behaviors. And that might be reason why the East Lake bass are moving around everywhere, and maybe the West Lake fish kind of stay within the lake and the West Lake side. Just a smaller, West Lake's just a little bit smaller on shoreline habitat, versus East Lake is pretty almost, quite larger than the west side of the lake. But those details can be fleshed out and more time from getting other input from others. But still, anglers, help to recognize that change over time when SAV is present versus when it's absent could change angling success. I also take a moment to comment on the common carp presence in the lake not helping. And this has been a transition from relatively from the largemouth bass work to looking into how we can improve SAV at the lake. But the common carp biomass is estimated at 4 million pounds of carp in that lake. So about 100 pounds per acre, and it's totally, out of balance. And so the SAV the Weber and Brown paper from 2009 highlight the relative interactions of common carp as it relates to SAV, sport fish, large and small zooplankton, and those types of things. So in the presence of that amount of carp, that's an important component to be looking at. Also, just to highlight that these findings, when we saw in the largemouth bass that stayed in the canals and they're not really moving out of the canals, there is some concern about the shoreline erosion and sedimentation that's occurring along the canals of Mattamuskeet. And the lower left is a graphic developed by Randall Etheridge at East Carolina University, looking at this. And the blue line is the water level. The green is the current measured depth. And the red line was what the original canal depths were. And the image on the right was taken in 2021 by Kendall Smith, showing that pile up behind the Mattamuskeet Lodge. And really, if back in the distance is the East Canal. And so it could be possible that that sedimentation kept those bass in the East Canal with little interchange between lake and canal habitats. With that, I'll wrap up. Just again, the teamwork and collaboration on this study through many years. The Creel survey in 2014, all the work and effort in electrofishing, the work that we've done on the project, so many people that have been involved on this, from both in field work and those that have helped me enter Qualtrics data for the receiver information, Susan Wagner. There are just so many people involved in this, and it just highlights the importance of collaboration and echoes just how much passion and work we put to these components. So I couldn't have done this by myself, and just wanted to thank everyone that has been involved and continues to be involved in this project. And with that, I'll wrap it up, say thank you. Want to recognize National Fishing and Boating Week coming up. This picture was taken back in 2008 at the bridge, and I hope to see that again and have the opportunity. And with that, I'll entertain any questions or comments you may have. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Great presentation on a very long history of work there. I know you guys been working at Mattamuskeet for a long time, and it's very interesting how all the different aspects of that work have come together over time. If anybody has any questions, if you will, put them in the chat. I guess I'll start off with a question. And I'm wondering, you hit on this a little bit, but I'm wondering over time how you think the whole sea level rise issues with the canals and everything, where they're positioned, how you think that might influence some of what you were seeing.
Yes, I mean we're talking about lake levels that really is at sea level. Those USGS gauges are, looking at a sea level over time. The tidal gates are intended to work when on a relative scale, relative depths of water. If the lake level is high, the fresh water moves out. If the canal side is high, then that comes in. We saw it just briefly there on the salinity impacts on the east side of the lake, where most of the Pamlico Sound is on that east side. So the storm surge that occurs with the hurricanes and hurricane events pushing in, even today's or this week's event, this low event happening right now, could influence how that water moves um, uh, across that landscape. And in some cases, thanks to Robert Wayne and many of his observations while patrolling the lake, has actually seen those times that the water control structure is compromised, that, that water movement will actually move right over top of the water control structure. So even though the tidal gates are down, that water is moving in. We also know from work from Charlton Godwin in 2002 when he did his thesis at ECU and looking at fish migration at Wapopka Canal, that he actually worked to show that in opening those canals and leaving them open, and that salinity actually increased on the on the east side of the lake near Wapopan, showing that if those tidal gates are not operational, that sound side flooding will influence the lake environment, water quality. So yes, absolutely something we need to keep an eye on, and that's what the management challenge is. So thanks for adding that, and yeah, kind of adds more to that story.
All right, thanks for that. Anybody else have any questions for Kevin? I'm seeing lots of compliments and great jobs in the chat. So you hit towards the end on one of the big issues from, at least from my perspective, relative to total management of that lake, and that is the SAVs. And by
Yes.
total management, I mean for aquatic resources, for avian resources, for all the different resources that are in or utilize that lake. Um, in your opinion, if you had to rate all the different things that could be done to potentially address the SAV issue, what management action would you put at the very top of the list?
Yeah, and so to reiterate, the submerged aquatic vegetation and the Matamesquite Technical Working Group that compiles all of that, the SAV abundance is the index point that we're managing for success or monitoring for that success. And the SAV conceptual model that by Brinson, showing each component that works towards SAV abundance. And the amount of work that we've done at that lake in collaboration with NC State and ECU and looking at that model specifically, it really points to common carp biomass removal at this point. The herbicide toxicity, was something that was looked at, but pretty much NC State found that's not a likely issue. Obviously, there's sedimentation and turbidity and wind resuspension of that. But again, the common carp and their activity of actually just continually uprooting the available SAV that could get started in rooting and going, they just keep that just constantly stirred up. And again, common carp do not eat the vegetation. It's their activity to go through that sediment and just keep turning it over and over and doing that. And it's not like carp haven't been in the lake during the times that there was SAV. It's just now they're out of ecological balance. And so there's a lot of work done in Minnesota and the Midwest on that. And one lake near and dear to my heart growing up in Iowa was Clear Lake. And the carp biomass removal absolutely changed that lake from common carp, bullheads, other rough fish to more of SAV and other cleaner, water quality improvements and those types of things. And so with that, there's a large invasive species grant that we were awarded as a team. That's $1 million coming to the group. Working on it right now, October 2022. We're supposed to let through and bring in some commercial operators that can remove that, or at least get that abundance down so that we could look at any success there. Prior work in the 1950s by Cahoon and the refuge managers at that time and refuge personnel, the carp removal program there allowed for 15,000 acres of SAV to come back in 2 years. And they removed about 1.7 million pounds of carp 4 years prior to that. So I think there's evidence to show that the applied research we're working at, and to really flip the script on common carp, reduce their reproduction as best we can with the bluegill stockings. Do not allow them into the lake. There's barriers that are in place right now. And just continue to keep the pressure on those common carp really would give us a stronger leg up as to SAV improvements.
All right, that's great. You hit on a couple of my follow-up questions, so I'm going to move to something else that's in the chat. The
Yep.
question for you is, how do you plan to communicate with anglers what you found in relation to their perceptions about largemouth bass fishing?
Yeah, great. And this project wrapped up in 2019, and there were a number of anglers that I continued just to communicate with, those that indicated a problem. And so just the initial just communication of being out there and what our findings were. Do need to get more opportunities out there to share with anglers, yes, and to highlight that. So kind of a work in progress to continue sharing this information.
All right, Kevin, I appreciate it again. That's all we have in the chat. And I've sort of run out of questions, so I'll let you off the hook. I had one had one biopolitical question I was going to ask you, but I'll hold that for later.
Okay.
Um, and so I'll just thank you again for the presentation and all the great work. I appreciate everybody who tuned in. And we'll have our next presentation, as always, on the second Tuesday of the month. So we're looking at the second Tuesday of June. And so hope everybody has a good rest of your day. And again, thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a great day.